All right. Welcome back, everyone. It is time to dive into the actual meat of Exodus. But before we get there, I told you all that I would let what we talked about 2 weeks ago kind of simmer in your head, see if you had any questions. I let you all know of the 2 movies that could be watched if you wanted. And I'm curious of just any reflections over the past 2 weeks that you've had simmering in your head about the introduction of Exodus, some of the movies, because I know some of you all watched them. What are your all's opening thoughts?
Helen and I watched Charlton Heston. Now, that movie was made in 1956. So that's 67 years ago. And, there were some obvious things in it that this was an old movie, but it was amazingly well done. I thought it was a fun, enjoyable movie, even though it took 4 hours, I think.
Ooh, I forgot it was that long. Yeah.
Well,
cocktails.
There are 2 of them. There's the long one and the short. Well, the very long one and the long one. And we watched the very long one.
Did you get it from the library or where?
From Amazon Prime.
Oh, they have it on Amazon Prime. Okay.
Yeah. $3.99.
Oh, you have to.
Best chariot chase ever.
It's the one you have to pay. That means I have to watch it on my computer.
And we got Prince of Egypt. I got it from the library.
Yeah.
Free.
That's more recent. I wanted to watch that when I first read about it, and or it was during the
Yeah, what'd you all think of the animated one? It's definitely not Charlton Heston.
Gary commented that it needed to be, we definitely would have needed to see it on a huge screen because it was a little bit dark. But one of the things, the animation is beautiful. One of the things we noticed was the coloration in the first part, before the Exodus. The coloration is more desert colors, a little more muted. And then as soon as the Exodus begins, you see for the first time a blue sky.
Oh.
And the colors become a little brighter. I don't know. Gary, being a graphic artist, would probably be able to say it better than I.
You covered it real well, but you're right. It needs to be seen on a big screen because the colors are they're so close in values that you have a hard time sometimes following the action.
The chariot race,
but it was still good.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was really charming. I did notice that they for some reason they left out the plagues. It was a little, the killing of the firstborns was kind of glossed over, I thought, but they
had the frogs.
What?
They did the frogs.
I didn't see.
It was fast. It was what, Gary, 5 seconds of frogs?
I was looking for frogs. I must have blinked my eyes.
You must have blinked because it was very quick. You're right. They did gloss over the plagues somewhat.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I think it's good to talk about the films is because film and TV very much makes up a lot of what we remember about this story.
Yes.
Those stories are great in like making things iconic and making certain things stick, but they're both adaptations.
Yes.
Very much adaptations. I mean, like you were saying, when a movie like the 10 plagues is like one of the key parts of the story, and when it's kind of glossed over, you get a different story. And so, but very much with the 10 Commandments, that one is just like cultural icon. That movie is not necessarily accurate to the text. So it's good to remember what's in the movie, because it's going to contrast with sometimes what's in the Bible. And if there's times where you're like, wait, I thought this and it's not in there, pause and say it, because it's kind of interesting seeing where screenwriters have changed things. But one other funny just culture. Oh, yeah, Mary Ellen.
Well, speaking of that, it kind of disconcerted me how much emphasis was put on reuniting with his mother. You know, there was more emphasis on that than on the plagues. So, you know, that adaptation did catch me by surprise.
Yeah. Interesting. I will admit, I haven't seen The Prince of Egypt. I think my friends sat me down to watch it in seminary, but it was not my go-to movie myself. A lot of people love the soundtrack, so it is what it is. But the funny cultural fact, evidently, the studio was working on The Prince of Egypt and the movie Shrek at the same time. And the legend, the lore is, if people were misbehaving, they got taken off of the Prince of Egypt and got put on Shrek. And the term was, you got Shreked, because they actually thought the Prince of Egypt was going to be a bigger phenomenon than the movie Shrek, which turned out not to be true.
No.
So ever since I learned that, like, I will never hear those or think about those two movies the same way.
But I did do a little reading on Prince of Egypt, and according to what I read, it said that they tried to stick to the book of Exodus as much as they could.
Yes.
Perhaps appealing to emotions would have lengthened or emphasized the part of reuniting with your mother. They also cautioned that the plague parts that they did have could be disturbing for very young children. So they had to really consider their audience for a cartoon when they were coming up with, you know, everything that they would emphasize.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
The thing that I really liked about it is his relationship with his Egyptian family. He was very attached to his brother. They had, I know, an ambivalent relationship, I guess, but they, you know, it was not easy for him to leave.
Right. So with that in mind, let's go to the text, and we're like, hold on to all of these tidbits that we remember, and let's see if they're in the story. But today we have just chapter 1, which kind of gets us into the story. And it gets us into the story very quickly. So Exodus 1, chapter 1, of course, we start off with a genealogy. These are the names of the sons that came to Egypt. You get all the sons of Jacob. The total of people born to Jacob was 70. And then we have, oh yeah, and Joseph was already in Egypt. So we have that kind of genealogy. We're used to it, right? But then we kind of, this is where we just like jump right into the story. After that, then Joseph died, all of his brothers, and the whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, and the land was filled with them.
When it says Joseph or Jacob had 70 descendants, does that mean he fathered 70 children?
Indirectly. Normally when this is talked about, it's including his sons and his sons' kids. So kind of like how he adopted Joseph's son. So that would be taking the family portrait with kids and grandkids.
Okay.
Plus, remember, he had concubines.
Yeah. Yeah, 4 wives, their kids, and then their kids. So you're seeing the 70 is like including basically 3 generations together with Jacob at the top.
Okay.
Only the men.
Only the men, right.
Right.
Which still, that's a big family.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I did not remember ever learning the reason why they had to leave Egypt, with the new king being threatened by their population and their strength. I guess I never had it in my memory bank here that what actually precipitated their need to be allowed to leave. So that was new for me.
Well, they were killing firstborn sons.
Well, but yeah, they did that first with them, but then just like in verse 11, therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. That chunk is missing in my memory.
Watch 10 Commandments. They made a lot of bricks in the movie. It's obvious.
So right here, between kind of verse 7 and verse 10, we have the setting up of the main conflict. At the end of Genesis, we were kind of like saying, okay, this might be a problem, this might be a problem, and kind of seeing how it's setting up this situation here. So this is telling you right here, this is the thing that's setting off the rest of the dominoes. So if you remember, the Israelites are in the Goshen, which is this very fertile land. They have their flocks, they have their things, and in verse 7, we're seeing they are multiplying and exceedingly. The verbiage there should ring bells because it's the same of the blessing that we get in the creation story. God says to Adam, be fruitful and multiply. And here we're like, okay, they were fruitful, they grew prolifically, and they multiplied. They did the thing. But this is going to be an issue because they are still seen as outsiders.
Well, they kept themselves separate.
Right.
So it was from both sides.
Right. Yeah. It's two ways where we have already gotten a few comments that Egyptians think that the Hebrew people are dirty sheep herders, so they don't want to be around them, but also the Israelites want to like stay separate because they want to maintain their own culture. But all of a sudden, you have this very large population that is not Egyptian living in Egypt. And so is this cause for, so why is this cause for worry for the king? I mean, you kind of get his explanation here. Like, why is it unnerving when you have a big group of people that are not culturally similar to you in the same area?
Well, could they join with another group to overthrow the king?
They could. Yeah, they could do that. I have in my head that that the Egyptians liked people who came there to assimilate. I don't know where I read that. Well, maybe in one of the commentaries, that they wanted people to assimilate, and the Jews didn't assimilate. Not like here.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, it says in 10 that the Pharaoh was afraid that in the event of war, the Hebrews would join their enemies and fight against us, and then escape from the land, which would be their labor force that would leave them. So, I mean, he was feeling very threatened on multiple fronts.
I think about this kind of even in our modern sense, how we talk about immigration and different people groups living in one place. Some of these fears like still exist today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I remember like after 9/11, like the discussion around, well, we have people who are Muslim in this country, will they be loyal to us? Or are they going to be more loyal to people of their own religion? And there was this questioning and there was the fear that existed then. Yeah.
first time I encountered that was when John F. Kennedy was running for president, and he was Catholic. And the whole debate at that time was if we were in conflict with the Pope and what the Pope was saying, which way would he go? Would he follow the Pope or would he lead the nation? And I just remember the uproar at that time.
Yes.
I can see Sue nodding. That was just huge. And that's the first time this conflict appears in my memory.
There was a
I remembered it appearing back when Franklin Roosevelt ran for president. One of the leading Republican candidates was Catholic. And, you know, I recall my father telling us, oh, they can't nominate him. If he ever got elected, the Pope would be running the country.
Yes.
There was a Democrat, wasn't it? Smith.
Yeah, Smith was.
Yeah.
I guess it was. Yeah, it was a Democrat, Smith.
So it's one of those things that this fear is in some ways evergreen. When you have a place that has a mixture of cultures, there sometimes can be the fear, who is your loyalty going to be based around?
Right.
And the thing is, we know Joseph was like had a good relationship with the Pharaoh. They had good like relationships. Joseph was very loyal to Pharaoh, like at least by the story. He did all these things and actually like took all the money for Pharaoh in like throughout the famine. So the question is, thinking a little bit in this context, so the Israelites still see themselves as separate. Is this actually a danger, or are the Egyptians creating a danger by fearing them?
Both.
Say more.
Well, the fact that the Hebrews were multiplying and they were being successful at what their mission was, to be fruitful and multiply. But they were also becoming wealthy at the time and becoming a real threat to Egyptian culture. And, you know, so this new Pharaoh, and I'm kind of picturing him as he's beginning to lead and trust his decisions and his advisors and, you know, creating a new regime after the previous Pharaoh died. Now he's feeling threatened by the status of the Hebrews, that they are a true threat to his economy and to the Egyptian way of life. If they continued to multiply at the speed they had been, they would overtake the population. So, you know, this was coming to a head as a real crisis.
Well, making them all slaves certainly didn't increase it. It wouldn't encourage them to feel loyal. You know, treating them like beasts.
Yeah, that's kind of the catch-22 here of this situation is, okay, they're a threat, but what, like, thinking about what oppression does when you basically turn people into slaves, that it's like, can you keep them under your thumb, or what does that do to their loyalty then? So just a quick note about language here, because we did kind of gloss over something that I think is helpful to understand. Verse 8, the new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. My notes at the bottom of the page say that it's more a closer translation may actually be, he did not care about Joseph, he paid no mind to it. It's not that like he had no knowledge of Joseph, but it's more like he took no notice of Joseph. He didn't care. It just more of that sense than like he had no knowledge of this guy, if that makes a little bit more sense.
The famine was over, yeah.
Yeah, Gary?
The first Pharaoh and Joseph's relationship was pretty strong, and I would assume unusual, and had gone on for a long time. And you know, he established the Goshen area and welcomed him and all this. So the new pharaoh, they're just other people running around here that I'm worried about.
Yeah. So I heard Mary Ellen and then Sue.
I kind of lost my train of thought, but thinking about this new pharaoh and whether he actually knew Joseph or not, to me it makes sense that he actually did know Joseph because of the way the power shift was passed down son to son to son to son, that he would have grown up knowing Joseph. But Joseph had so much control over the previous pharaoh's economy that, you know, he was managing all the money. He was managing all of the people coming in wanting grain during the famine. And I mean, Joseph was basically running the kingdom at that point. And a new pharaoh would be threatened by that.
Not only that, now Joseph is dead. So it's one of those that, like, the guy who did the things, he's gone, but he left his people behind. So, like, even if you trusted that one person is no longer, that one very powerful person is not in the picture anymore. So we have new Pharaoh, we have no Joseph, now we have a bunch of Egyptians and a bunch of Hebrew people. So, but yeah, I can see what you're saying, Mary Ellen, of like, oh yeah, my dad had this one guy oversee so much. Do I really want to hand this guy the same amount of power? And when he passes away, do I really want to nominate someone else from his group of people to have that same amount of power? Probably not.
Okay.
So their solution is they are building cities. You have the two cities, Pithom and Ramses. And so they were oppressed, and they were the ones making the bricks. They were doing the field labor. But even doing that and setting taskmasters over them, they multiplied even more. So this is once again where I find it fascinating how while this is a part of a story and we know part of God's promise is that the people will multiply, this is something once again I see people talk about in the modern day. Because one of the things they say is the fastest way to decrease the birth rate is to educate people. Education and birth rate have a very connected relationship. And I've seen some anthropologists theorize that when you are doing back-breaking labor, when you have nothing else, if you're so poor you can't afford anything, the one enjoyment in life you have is another human. And when that is your main form of entertainment, you get a lot of kids. And so it's one of those that there often is a relationship between birth rates, education, poverty, and backbreaking labor. So once again, it almost seems like the fears of the Egyptians are becoming almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. That they're trying to oppress them and make their numbers smaller. And what's happening instead is that their numbers are ballooning.
Well, that's interesting. I was thinking about the kind of the problem in Brooklyn, where the very ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews have terrible schools, and it's been a scandal. And I wonder if that's intentional, to not to educate. Oh, because most Jews are very highly educated. If they aren't Orthodox.
It's often related specifically to the education of girls, but okay. That's the one it's most strongly tied to. But if you are not educating people with certain basics of how populations increase, and teaching people how, like, the whole realm of like how do babies come about, then kids are doing it anyways because kids are kids, and there's that whole like loop that if you don't tell kids about it, then you end up with kids anyways.
Mhm.
Does this have any relevance to like the current Taliban's suppression of education for women? Or is that based solely on simply, women are second-class citizens anyway, and there's no sense in worrying about them?
There's a both and relationship there. It is, yes, women are second class. It is education often involves, or educating women and girls often gives them more agency, empowers them to say no to things they don't want to do. And so, but one of the things that an empowered woman is able to say no to is a partner's advances. If you disempower them, then that is one of the things, you're more at the mercy of what your family members want to do. And so, yes, it does have a relationship with family sizes, because I don't know this study off the back of my head, but I remember learning that like women tend to want fewer kids simply because you're the one carrying the kid and going through the pain of that. But especially in not not in the industrial world, but the rest of the world, women tend to want fewer kids. And if they are not empowered to say no, then they're not empowered to make those choices. So there is a slight connection.
Okay.
So, all right. So the other note on language is, I don't quite know what yours says. Where's the line? Oh, here we go. Verse 13. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites. Once again, one of the comments underneath is literally that they worked the Israelites to the point of collapse. So this is worked literally to the point of exhaustion here, is what they're implying. But since this evidently is not working, the people are still multiplying. The king of Egypt instead goes to Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives. So what do you think of this conversation between the midwives, the pharaoh, and what the midwives decided to do? Yeah.
I found it interesting that the midwives were Egyptian. Didn't the Hebrews have their own midwives?
No, he says it to the Hebrew midwives. Verse 15.
There.
Okay, I missed it. Okay, yes, you're right, Clay. It is there.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the Pharaoh's asking them to make decisions about their own people. That's outrageous. I mean, be bad enough if the Egyptians were doing it.
They gave birth before the midwives could get there.
So that's their explanation. Oh, these hardy Hebrew women, they're just strong. They do it all themselves. Once again, this is actually a stereotype that has been passed culture through culture, and we still see it today. So this is something that was often said about enslaved women in the American South is, oh, those women, they're so strong, they don't need help, unlike the frail white women that need all the help and everything. And it's carried through today. I've still seen studies that Black women have higher rates of maternal mortality, often because their pain is not taken seriously. They're given less pain medication because they are assumed to be stronger.
Oh, I thought it was just pure meanness.
No, there was a study I was reading about, like, nurses thinking that people of African descent have thicker skin, therefore like they can endure more pain. It's literally still a medical myth that's passed around. But one of them is literally that Black women are given less pain medication and are treated for like conditions like preeclampsia. It takes them longer to get treatment, which has higher rates of mortality, often because their pain is not dealt with in the same way. So it's interesting that, like, we see these stereotypes that are like in this text, and yet while we see them at play in these two cultures, we see how some of these just reverberate through history, and is kind of the way that like different cultures clash with each other again and again. So, but this time it works for the advantage. Oop, I just lost my camera. It works for the advantage of the Hebrew women because their sons are not killed. Oop, come on. All right, well.
There you are.
There we are. Okay. I'm back. All right. So the Hebrew midwives are like, nope, we're not killing babies, and they give this excuse. Hebrew women are just stronger than Egyptian women. They're already, the kids are already born by the time we get there. So the final solution, I think, is the one that is included in the story in the two movies, but is also just more well known as, okay, if we can't kill them when they're coming out, we're just gonna throw them into the Nile.
Wow.
Yeah, the animation for that in the movie is very interesting. The Prince of Tides cartoon, or I mean, sorry, Prince of Egypt cartoon, with using the hieroglyphics to illustrate that.
Yeah.
That was very clever.
Yeah.
Very cleverly done.
Well
and
done.
very really sticks with you.
Right. But notably, this time around, it's not just the midwives that are instructed to do this. This is just Egyptians. Egyptians, go out and do this thing. Kill these children, throw them into the Nile.
Wow.
Awful.
So my question for you all is, do you know of a gospel parallel to this? Because this comes up in the Christmas story.
Killing the first, yeah, that's what Herod did.
Herod did, yeah.
Yeah, when I believe it's specifically in the Gospel of Matthew, when the wise men come from the east and say, "Hey, there's a king born to you. Where is he?" Herod kind of goes, "Oh shoot, this isn't good. If there's an actual king, then I'm gonna not be king." And so he says, go find this child. Here's where we think the location is, and then come back to me and tell me where he is. And the script, let me see if I can actually find it. I did not tab this. Here we go.
Yeah, Herod was Jewish, wasn't he?
He was.
Yeah.
Herod was he was not, yes and no. So he joined the Jewish religion. He was a convert, but if I remember correctly, he was not actually ethnically Jewish.
Oh.
So he had this like questionable status. He was put as the king, but he was not a king of the people.
Okay. I didn't know that. Okay.
But in a dream, the wise men were told of Herod's plan. So if you remember, they go home by a different route. And then Joseph is warned about Herod's plot because they're going to go and kill all the kids. Let's see. This is Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. When Herod heard that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed the children in and around of Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that they learned from the wise men. But Joseph was warned in a dream. So do you know where Joseph and the Holy Family go?
Egypt.
To Egypt, right?
Do you think that's a historical fact that happened?
Are you asking me personally? No, I don't.
Good story.
So one of the things that especially the Gospel of Matthew does, and if I'm going to bring out these gospel parallels when they exist, the Gospel of Matthew is notorious for being more of the gospel written for the Jewish people. Matthew does a lot of work to make Jesus look like Moses. And this is one of the things that if Jesus is supposed to be the savior of the Israelites, then he kind of goes through the motions of what the people of Israel do. The people left the land of Canaan, they went to Egypt, and then they came out of Egypt. The story's in a slightly different order. His life is threatened as a child. They go to Egypt, but then he comes out of Egypt. But it's only in the Gospel of Matthew does this happen. So it's one of those that I think this is a flourish to make Jesus look like Moses.
Yes.
But it is there, or it is in the story, and maybe it happened. It just...
I didn't realize that Matthew was trying to make him look like Moses. I just knew it was a more Jewish gospel. That's really...
Oh yeah, there's other parallels. Like I said, I'll bring them out when I know them.
Right. It's already read Matthew, right?
Yep.
Old.
So this kind of gets us into at least the situation. It sets up the situation itself for the gospel of where, or not the gospel, for the book of Exodus of where the conflict is coming from. It's population, it's fear, frankly, it's xenophobia of the Egyptians being afraid of this group of people here. It may be called for, it may be not, but I'm curious about what you're all thinking about how this sets the situation up. What are your thoughts on like how the Egyptians are handling this? What would you think if you were one of the Hebrew people and this was happening?
You'd have to have a lot of patience if you're Hebrew. You're going to wait a long time.
Yeah.
Well,
I think it would be natural for any oppressed people to want to escape an overlord as cruel as this Pharaoh turned out to be. It amazes me that they were able, and when they were worked to the point of collapse, that they were able to get the strength to function as a group and say that, plan that they wanted to escape. And that was one of Pharaoh's big concerns, that they would escape because that's his labor force. So it just seems like it's a natural conflict that we've seen throughout history in many other ways, but I'm just kind of astounded that the Hebrews could pull it off when they were worked to that point. Sorry, that's my doorbell ringing and I'm ignoring it.
Okay. It is interesting to see kind of the dual nature of the fearing of the people, the like not liking the numbers of these people, all of that like animosity, and yet you're our workforce, so I need you.
Yeah.
I don't want you to leave, but I'm not gonna like you. And kind of that interesting dynamic that it's not like the Pharaoh is going to the people and saying, hey, you're our workforce, let's have a good relationship. We need you to keep working, so like how can we do it so you're loyal to us, and like if the other people come in, you're not going to be loyal to them. Like that's not the conversation they're having.
Didn't Joseph turn a lot of the Egyptians into slaves?
Responding. Come on in and do whatever you need to do.
Okay. Yes. So that was part of the thing that, let's see, where
I think I missed that week, but it's
Now coming from some of the trains.
but I was
yes.
interested in it because I thought it was
And that
story.
colors coming out.
After he reunited to his with his father, he started doing kind of means.
Yes. So that is 40 or Genesis 47, kind of starting in verse 13. To by the end, let's see. So like verse 20 of chapter 47. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and the Egyptians sold them their fields because the famine was severe, and the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he made slaves of them, for one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests did he not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, yada, yada, yada. And so, yeah, we see here that, in chapter 47, because of that famine of that 7 years, Joseph was able to buy all of the land. So all of the land belongs to Pharaoh. And then he subjugated all of the people under that. So they were all slaves from one end of Egypt to the other. This is where the two stories connect, because yeah, Joseph wasn't good to the people, but now this tide has turned. Joseph is gone, new Pharaoh in place, and all of a sudden they're looking around going, huh, this situation isn't good, is it?
During the earlier part of Joseph's time in Egypt, the thought was it was during the time of Ramses II, right?
That is what they're assuming is the time frame for the Exodus, actually. So
for the Exodus. Okay, so they are okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So notably, there's two different pharaohs in this book of Exodus. Yeah. Which makes 3 pharaohs total that the Bible deals with. So this would have been the pharaoh that we're getting at the beginning of Exodus would be Ramses II father, which I don't know my Egyptian pharaohs enough to know if that's Ramses I then. But it's one of those that are,
because Ramses II ruled for a long time. And right. They mentioned in there that one of the cities that the Jewish people built was Ramses.
Right. So, I believe that's the first let me check.
Because they know more about when the pharaohs changed, that was, and after Ramses II was what? Was that Akhenaten or Tutmos?
It would be Tutmos III. So Seti the first is who predates Ramses II. But notably, Ramses is the second and not the first.
Yeah, So Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's what they had in the Ten Commandments. They had Seti, and then
Okay.
they had Ramses taking over. They just referred to him as Ramses, you know, but he was the nasty Yul Brynner one all the way through the end. Yeah.
Yeah. So one more note, since we're talking about history, also coming from the notes here, that letters from Egyptian agents to the land of Canaan to the pharaohs of in the 14th century BCE complain of landless Aparu joining forces with rebellious towns. Scholars have suggested the link between these landless folks and the Hebrew, and that the Egyptians' term for them may have been the Aparu. So this is one where that's what kind of dates it to in and around Seti and Ramses, is this 14th century group of landless people that they're talking to, and like the pharaoh is talking to the people in the land of Canaan about these landless people that seem to be joining together and rising up. So using this kind of as a lens to think about our context today and how we deal with people that we see as multiplying, people that we see as maybe being a threat to us, kind of our own dynamics. What do we see here that we're like, oh, this is a lesson in how not to relate to people that we maybe we're not culturally the same with, that maybe are in and around us? So what do we see that we don't want to repeat? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Slavery.
Okay, say more.
In the South, in the plantations, to me, that's just the corollary here of.
Well, we don't have slaves anymore, but
you know, but somebody else can go with it. Slavery is what comes to mind.
I mean, notably abolitionist, when we were trying to do away with slavery, like Exodus was key, because people, I mean, it's hard to look at this and say, oh no, oppressing people is good. We want to be like the Egyptians. Yeah. So any corollaries that are a little bit closer in time? That is a key historical one. Exodus is also very much used in the civil rights movement. Very intentionally. Yeah, Larry?
Maybe our attitude about different people, be they different religion, different thoughts about gender, different, anybody that's different, you know, might our attitudes against them be similar to the Egyptians' attitudes against the Hebrews? And maybe global warming is our first plague.
Oh, Larry, do I need to give you a pulpit?
I don't.
Yeah, Sue, what are you thinking?
There's a big rise in anti-Semitism. Well, I don't think it's all that new, because I've been listening to, when I was working, I heard all sorts of anti-Semitic remarks from my clients. And but in any case, it doesn't particularly make sense at this point, because the intermarriage of Jews and Christians is enormous. It's like 67% or something like that. So you're not going to get a really threatening body of people, but a lot of I don't think it's related to reality, because but I never understand anti-Semitism anyway, but it isn't as though the Jews have risen up and they're going to take over the country. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But what you notice when you see a list of people donors who have given to the symphony and the Art Institute, is maybe 3/4 of them have Jewish names. So I don't know if they're Jews or not, but you know, they're traditionally Jewish names. So the philanthropy is very big. I don't know, to me, it's not a threat, but it's a real threat for people. So I'm not sure why. I know what they.
There's
because
often there's a
Yeah.
thought that it is not the upfront. I think this is, I want to clarify, I do not believe this even in the slightest, but it's one of those, I know the rhetoric and the thought is it is a shady group of people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes. Not like they're going to take over by numbers now, but it's like, if you can't do numbers, you do it in power. I believe that is just anti-Semitism from the Middle Ages come back to haunt us,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yes.
But one of the things that I think our country needs to grapple with a little bit is the one that I see as our current very big parallel is actually dealing with our Latinx population of immigration coming from the Latin countries north.
Yes.
Because it's one of those that we see a similar situation where like their numbers are like we do see a increase of population. Some people would say it's ballooning and they're taking over, and you see that kind of fear. They're often the ones doing back-breaking labor. There are farm workers, there are a lot of construction workers, they are the people doing the heaviest labor, and yet there's a lot of fear of what it means and like what is going on with these people. Are they law-abiding people? Are they not? Do we know? We don't. And that question has a lot of people very afraid.
They're most upwardly mobile of any group. Immigrants are very upwardly mobile, and so yeah. So it doesn't. The reality is not. Initially it's really overwhelming and hard to deal with, but after a generation, it's a big plus.
So, but the question is, or what we see here is oppression of a group of people often backfires if you're just trying to like push them down, whether it is detainment, whether it is like incarceration. The things we're doing now is often very similar to just trying to like keep the numbers down, press them down, and there's a lot of fear. And it's one of those that I'm wondering, because my question is like, what could the Egyptians have done differently? Because we know they didn't choose a good path. So the question is, today, when we're seeing a situation that has some of the hallmarks of it, it's like, how do we not be the Egyptians?
Make friends,
Maybe. It's not to say there isn't issues. There probably was some issues in Egypt with this, like, we've already said, like, it's kind of a problem. Like, Joseph didn't set him up well. There is problems to be had, but killing children is not the proper solution. So I don't want to be an Egyptian, but what I know is I'm actually probably closer in this situation to the Egyptians than I am the Hebrew people. So
probably, I would think, you take a high enough view, an opportunity for the use of or focus on assimilation to a certain extent, so they could just blend right in if they were included. And because the important thing, I think, is that the Egyptians wanted to retain their culture and their structure, and if they melded in and over generations, that they could have avoided.
But the second question, I'm going to challenge you here, and this is not because this is just keeping the thought going, like following things to its end. It's not that what you're saying is wrong, Gary, but what would have happened if the Hebrew people assimilated? Would we have this text if they just merged their culture in with the Egyptian culture?
No, you wouldn't. The story would be a different story. Yeah.
You can't, there's in the early stuff about when immigration was very big earlier in the 20th century, there was a lot of debate about either assimilation or it was going to be a melting pot, or were the people going to be allowed to maintain their culture. And some of the scholars thought that the melting pot was unrealistic for a lot of people, and it's less so now. I mean, the melting pot is the Irish and the English and the Scottish. I mean, maybe the French, Germans, but generally speaking, a lot of the immigrant groups have maintained their culture by hanging out together. It's actually going on. So maybe it won't last forever. Because the Spanish people learn, there's a language problem, there's a color problem. You can tell who's Spanish. You can tell. How do they the non-Hispanic? What's the term? They're the people from, some of them people are white and some of them are not. So I don't know how to identify it on the census. People who are primarily European in background are accepted more. Yeah.
The descendants of the Spaniards can pass it, or are often very light skinned, so they're considered Hispanic. Latino is more of it's been a while. I'm rusty on my terms, but Latino and Hispanic are different, do have different connotations. Hispanic normally means descendant of Spaniards.
Yeah. No, and most of the people that come from South America and Mexico are married into the indigenous population, I think.
Right. Yeah. So, at any rate, but it's something to kind of consider. It's one of those natural things that, like, we always want to identify with the protagonist of the story, right? We like cheering for the good guys. We want to see ourselves in the good people. We want to be Aaron and Miriam and Moses. We want to be those people because they are the heroes of the story, and who wants to be the villain? But it's one of those, it's an interesting place that we're reading this because we are we are citizens of the United States, which is arguably the most powerful nation in the world. We are the ones with the strongest military, and we have abundant agricultural products that go throughout the world, which actually puts us closer to the Egyptians. In this story, they are the powerful nation. They are the army of the world. They are the breadbasket of the Middle East. At the time that they have the power. And there's a small group of people who are culturally dissimilar to them, who are growing in numbers, who are seen as a threat, who are seen as the other. And the question is, how are the Egyptians responding? And we know they don't respond well. So just pay attention to kind of what the Egyptians do that you don't like, where our culture kind of relates to the Egyptians, and where we want to be the protagonist, where we want to be the Hebrew people more. And if it's challenging, that's probably good. Scripture should not always make us comfortable. Sometimes it's meant to challenge us. So, but that sets us up for Exodus. Yeah, Mary Ellen, what you thinking?
Well, as I'm listening to all of this, what's coming to mind is when you assimilate a population, it certainly helps if you're the same religion. But you've got two diametrically opposite religions happening in Egypt, which is, both want to maintain their culture and their beliefs and their purity of generations. When we're talking assimilating, say in this country with different groups, at least we've got a foundation to work with. We have the Judeo-Christian system that allows us some flexibility as far as accepting people who are otherwise different from us. But when you have opposite religions maintaining their existence, I don't see a compromise. I don't see an assimilation happening here. I see the ones in power being eternally threatened by this uprising group that could take over the whole identity of their country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Muslims.
So, I mean, so there is a basis for connection today. And so the Islamic faith does connect, it is considered in the, like, the three faiths are the Abrahamic faiths. And so Muslims would actually say we worship the same God. Whether Christians like to say that or not is a completely different story. But you're right, there is a lot of the world is there is that a greater similarity in like religious faith that we could find basis in. But the question is, like, with language is very personal, and it's like, how does language mix when they're, like, you've heard me say again and again, there's certain things that you can't translate out of Hebrew. It just doesn't work. But the same thing is in Spanish, the same thing is in Chinese or Japanese, the same thing is for Hindi. There are things that just don't translate. And I very much believe there are some beautiful things that I think we'd be at a loss if we didn't have other languages. But the question is, how do you find that common story? That's what I go back to, is like, there is a common story. Do we want the common story to be religion? What other common story can we go back to? Because Mary Ellen, I think your point is like on the ball of like, these two groups do not share a common narrative. And at this point, for them, it's religious. It's very much a pantheon with a human as a god, versus we have a God that is personal, that is interacting, but is singular and invisible. And those cultures going head to head, neither of them wants to like incorporate the other's language. Right. Both of them see their culture as being valuable. How do you do this when both see their value in the thing that they have? And that is the thing that still exists today, is there are people coming that it's like, I want to share in your story, but there are things where I came from that I think are still valuable, and I'm not going to give it up.
Why should they? It's interesting. Yeah.
That is the question. So we're going to continue wrestling. But shall I pray us out for today? All right, let us pray. Gracious God, being around people is not always an easy thing, God. We have the story of the Tower of Babel, and God, you sent humans out with a diversity of language, with a diversity of experience, and we have created a diversity of culture. And here in Scripture, God, we see the conflict that arises. And in this discussion, we have seen how that conflict arises again and again, because God, we are imperfect and we struggle. And so we turn to you asking for help, because we believe that you are a God that brings all people together. You created us unique, and you gave us community, and you have asked us to love as you love. And God, it is so hard sometimes to do that. So help us see with your eyes, that we may see the beauty that you see in all people. Give us hearts to love the way you love, that is sometimes difficult and sometimes beyond even our understanding. And God, you are a God who forgives and gives us grace again and again for when we fall short. So help us internalize that grace, and help us give it to each other and to ourselves for when we know we are not living up to the love and to the grace you have given us. So I ask that you bless this group as we go out. Help trouble our hearts when we need to be troubled, and comfort us when we need that comfort, that we might always know that you love us for always and for all time. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Thank you, Chris.
Enjoy the sun today. It's gorgeous outside.
Yeah, see you next week.
All right.
Everybody.
Bye.